So I'm Jackie Carter, and I'm heavily involved in this program. Some of you will have seen me at other sessions. But my day job is I'm a professor in statistical literacy at the University of Manchester. And I've come to that role through a very non-conventional background. So I used to be a maths teacher. I used to teach at a school up the road in Cardiff. That was my first career. And then as a mature student, I went back and did computer science for my master's and PhD degree. But I always wanted to be a social scientist, and I've gravitated towards supporting social science students to do statistics over the course of my career, and that's what I do now. So everything I'm about to say, which is really just an introduction to Grace for her talk, comes from various lenses onto what we're all now calling loosely data science or data analysis. So I'm very much at the applied end. My first degree was in applied mathematics at the University of Sussex, and it's wonderful that this conference and the RSS embraces statisticians, and 2 years ago it was data users, and now it's become data scientists. So as far as I'm concerned, you know, the time for everybody in this room is now. But we've talked, and thank you, Deirdre, for your presentation. You've heard about statistical capacity development on a global level, and the way that we're in touch with Open Data Watch is that years ago, I met the head of the data development group at the World Bank, and he and I were on some conference together, we presented, and it became very apparent that we were talking about statistical capacity in two different ways. And he was very much talking about it from a statistical systems lens, and I was talking about it from a sort of training and skills lens. And what we did, we got some money and brought him over to the UK on a fellowship, and he and I co-authored an article on developing statistical capacities, and that has now developed into the relationship we've got with now Open Data Watch, which is where he went to as a co-founder, and it's just wonderful to see how this relationship that we set up 8-9 years ago has persisted and led to opportunities of the type you're going to hear about today. So there's a slide full of logos. Those are the logos of the organisations that the University of Manchester social science students have access to do a work placement. So that's just for this year. I've actually got another slide with a load more other logos on, but I thought what I could do is start this part of the presentation with a pictorial representation of where our students get the opportunity to go. And they can do that because, and funding is such an important part of this developing statistical capacities agenda, our students at the University of Manchester can do that because we have something called a Q-STEP Centre. Can you raise your hand if you've heard of Q-STEP in the UK? So a few, but not everybody, so thank you. So Q-STEP is a national initiative. The Q stands for quantitative, STEP is for step change, and the government have invested money into the higher education sector precisely because there are too few students coming out of social science and humanities undergraduate degrees having statistical capacity, let's say that, having the skill set and the appreciation of data analysis to go into the workplace and do the jobs that the 21st century requires of them. So it was a competitive bid. Manchester was one of 15 centres funded, and the way we chose, it's an experimental programme, so the way we chose to use the funding that is managed by the Nuffield Foundation, but is also contributed by the Economic and Social Research Council and HEFSI, which was a Higher Education Funding Council for England, as was. The way we at Manchester have decided to use that funding is twofold. One is to train all of our social science students on their substantive degree programmes from the first year in doing some statistics. So we're talking about politics students, sociology, criminology, language and linguistics, a whole range of students who ordinarily would not get statistical training when they come to university to do that type of degree. So we've embedded statistical training into their degree programme, so that's the first approach. The other thing we've done, very strategically, is to build in opportunities so that our students can do data analysis whilst they're still undergraduates. And what we hope to do is to turn heads, to show them that they do have the critical analysis skills, they can write essays, they can critique theory, but if we give them opportunities to practice those skills that they've been learning in the classroom at the computer lab, take them into the workplace and put them into practice, And because they're substantively interested in their subject, they're motivated to learn with peers in the organisations who will help support them. We've then got an opportunity to train the future generations, to skill up undergraduate students while they're still undergraduates. And that list is, however many, I haven't counted, the organisations that our students have gone to this year, which includes Open Data Watch. So our students get to apply for, it's very competitive, an opportunity to go and do a data-driven, research-led piece of work for 8 weeks in an organisation at the end of their second year. So they apply while they're still a second year student, but they go off into the summer of the end of their second year before their third year starts and do that piece of 8-week-long paid data-driven, research-led data analysis. And Grace is going to tell you about what she did today, but I just wanted to put that up there. Now, because of us having contact with those organisations and others, which aren't on that slide, so public, private, third sector, we're finding that's opening opportunities for our postgraduate students as well, and for our researchers. So Q-STEP and the work-placed learning that takes place is really, it's a game changer as far as we're concerned. We now have access to researchers in many of these organisations who are enabling our postgraduate researchers and our researchers to engage with, to collaborate on real-world social research problems.
My name is Deirdre Pell, and I am with Open Data Watch, and we're based in Washington, D.C. We are an organization that sits at the intersection of open data and official statistics with the aims of improving development data for sustainable development. I was connected with Jackie 2 years ago through the Q-STEP program, so that's kind of how I've found myself here. We were lucky enough to have a student through the program, and you'll hear a lot about it through Grace's presentation last year, and we came back for another year. So it's fun to not only have the summer with the intern in DC, but then to come back and be in the UK with them. So my presentation is going to focus on building statistical capacity through the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I'll kind of give a broad view of what's happening at the international development level from an international perspective, but then also build in the elements of statistical literacy and why that's important for this agenda. So we'll go ahead and get started. So for Open Data Watch, we kind of frame our work through the lens of the Sustainable Development Goals. All of our work points to 2030, when this agenda is set to be achieved. So the SDGs, as I'll refer to them, are an ambitious 15-year plan. They're a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the environment and planet, and ensure that people everywhere are living lives of peace and prosperity. You can see that there's 17 of them. Within those 17 goals, there's 169 targets, and then 230 some indicators to measure the progress towards achieving sustainable development. And like I said, they're ambitious, and they put tremendous data demands on international and national statistical systems to be able to provide the data for those 230 some indicators to measure and monitor progress. So digging a little bit deeper into what I mean about the data demands, like I said before, there's 232 indicators, and the tricky thing about the SDGs are that they were launched in 2015, but they were an agenda that was set up to be inclusive and to cover a lot of different development sectors. And part of that came this, I guess, consequence that not everything was ready to measure, so to speak. So we have a range of data availability for the different indicators. You see Tier 1 indicators, which are those that are, the thumbs up ones. The data is available. They're regularly produced. There are standards and methodologies in place. A lot of economic statistics, GDP would fall into this category. And then you have Tier 2, which are the gray areas. You have methodologies and standards in place, but you don't necessarily have the data being produced for these indicators. Something like this is an indicator on time use, so the amount of an indicator measuring how much time someone spends on domestic care work or unpaid labor, for example. The third is tier 3, which is, I think the ones that need the most attention and work. These are the ones where data is not being produced regularly and methodologies are still being tested and developed. So this kind of gives you a good broad brush around, what the SDGs are trying to measure and the data availability range for the different indicators. So while I think it's important to understand, the current challenge around the SDGs, it's also important to understand, I think, where we're starting from on an international level. Some of these, if you can see them, it's a little small, but some of these statistics and figures are taken from the recent OECD data cooperation report. The OECD every year puts out a thematic report that complements their aid spending report. So they track all of the aid flows, and every year they have a report. And the 2017 report for the first time focused on data for development. Previous sectors, public partnerships, education. This was the first year where data was the focus. And the focus of it was how do you, improve development data. So you see here that, one, for example, is 44% of countries worldwide don't have comprehensive birth and death registration. A really critical input for understanding population and death and even just legal identity as well. And then the last, to go back to that point of just the general lack of data for some of these SDG indicators. So, digging a little bit deeper onto this point of understanding the starting point and the current state of affairs, you can see that while there are a lot of instruments able to produce the data for tracking sustainable development, there's a current gap in the capacity to be able to produce the data for them. So there's certainly countries that are falling behind in the ability to produce data for the SDGs. If you take something like a poverty survey, which is a really critical input for a lot of low-income countries, 46% of them had not conducted a poverty survey at the recommended frequency of, every 5 years. Even something like the census, which is, critical for any country's policy and programming, 11% in the last 2010 census round, hadn't yet conducted their census for that round. So clearly there's a gap not only in, the data, but also the capacity on a country's part to be able to produce it. So it's not all gloom, There is progress that's being made. Here you can see, I'll describe it for you because it might be difficult. These are two charts that are put together from the World Bank Statistical Capacity Indicator database, and that is a ranking of a country's capacity to, produce data based on a certain criteria that they've put together. So on the left, you see a chart from 2004 and then 2016, and there is progress that's being made, at least in some regions. You see that, capacity, there is a movement from low capacity to even low middle and, some leap to high, but that's a big jump there. But I think despite the progress that is being made with some of the challenges that were identified with the SDG agenda, there is certainly room for progress, if not an acceleration of progress to build statistical capacity. So if we're looking at, the problem of statistical capacity, part of that solution will be raising resources and financing for statistics, especially in national statistical offices that are, under-resourced or overburdened. And here we're looking at some of the current spending levels at an international level towards statistics. And an organization called Paris 21 every year puts out a press report which looks at the funding levels that go towards statistics from an official development assistance perspective. And they put the number at $541 million US. that are spent from that flow to countries for statistics. And the graph here, the map here, you can see where some of those flows are going to. The majority of the countries being in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. But the point is that this number is very small. It's about 0.25% of official development assistance flows. So if you think about this large sustainable development agenda and a very small money being able to go towards producing the data to measure, monitor, and if you think of data as a critical input to also achieve the development goals, it's an issue you're also facing. And then the report, it doesn't just look at how much money is being spent, it also looks at who is giving it and how it's being given. And you see that 75% of all the aid that goes to statistics is by 5 donors. So you have the UNFPA that gives a lot of money for the census, for example. You have Eurostat, the World Bank, Canada, and the UK. And so the idea here is to show that there's a very high concentration of donors, and that part of the solution might be to diversify that portfolio or attract new investments for statistics beyond some of the traditional donors. Okay, so to go back to that point that, this isn't just to discourage or to say that, it's unachievable to get this data for the SDGs, but rather it's to raise awareness or present the case that with new challenges or with the new, problems or data gaps, there's also a need to have new approaches, to think about capacity development in a different way that perhaps moves beyond some of the traditional approaches and starts to look at certain new ways to think about capacity development and literacy and working with different communities on the issues here. Okay, so Open Data Watch is certainly not alone in thinking about a new approach to capacity building. Just last year, I think it was, the UN hosted its first UN Data Forum in Cape Town, South Africa. And this was a gathering of international development experts, but also statisticians and data scientists to really combat this issue that I presented earlier. And at the Cape Town UN Data Forum, they launched what was called the Global Action Plan for Sustainable Development Data. And this was a universal blueprint, I guess you could say, at how to modernize national statistical systems. And it was just recently in March adopted by the UN Statistics Commission. So even just a quick glance at these 6 thematic areas that make up the plan, you can see that there's new, I guess, thematic areas, as they're called, different, or I guess you might find surprising in terms of some traditional approaches to statistics, coordination and leadership. You even have built into the plan, if you read deeper into it, issues like building literacy among non-statistician communities as well. And so the next UN Data Forum is set to take place this October in Dubai. So every 2 years, this forum will take place that gathers development data experts. So meanwhile, while you have this global action plan that's been launched, you also have a Capacity Development 4.0 initiative that's taking place. And this is being led by both Paris 21, the organization I had mentioned before that puts out the press report on aid for statistics, but also more broadly the UN's high-level group on partnership and capacity building. And this initiative, if you think about the Global Action Plan as a vision for capacity development, you can think about Capacity Development 4.0 as some of the steps towards getting there, or some of the visions to follow. So on the left side, you see some of the traditional approaches to statistical capacity building in the past. They've been very much supply-driven. They are usually on a needs basis. A country has to, conduct a survey. They find a consultant who's able to, come in, support that work, and, fly out. It's very limited to a national statistical system. very much focused on technical aspects of, providing softwares, even computers, trainings in the technical aspects of it. And then we're starting to move towards what's called, the CD 4.0, or a new approach, which looks more holistically at a data ecosystem, one that exists beyond just a national statistics office. In that you think about working with user groups, not just the producers. You look at academia, you look at private sectors. You also look at different skills beyond maybe just the technical skills you might think about, but visualizations, even leadership and advocacy, and these different ones there. And I go back to the point before about funding, an approach to attract new donors for these efforts as well. And then lastly, just identifying and closing the data gaps, which the SDGs demand. So here we think about, we go back to Open Data Watch, and in our view of building capacity, we think of it as something that can be done at all stages of what's called the data value chain. So here we have a visual tool that we've put together that kind of maps out, I think in a very simplistic way, but it's intended to be that way. The path data travels from its inception and its collection all the way to its use and impact. And we found this to be a very useful tool to identify some enabling conditions that help us increase and spur the use of data and its value. But also identify certain challenges or roadblocks towards getting data to be used and have impact. So, you have the collection and the publication, which might be how we traditionally think about data. But then we also have this, other part of the chain, more towards the use, where we're thinking about how are we connecting with the end user? How are we, incentivizing use in different communities? How are we building skills to actually, promote a data use culture? And then, of course, how do we move forward to eventual impact of the data that goes beyond just the production stage? Okay, and so now starting to wrap up, I'll just share some kind of headline messages around building statistical capacity. There's certainly a lot more specific examples of this, but these are to, share some overarching themes. The first is raising the profile of data through documented evidence, use, and impact. I think with the community here, it's really easy to understand data's value and appreciate it and really think of it as something that's critical for policy and whatnot. But in terms of other communities outside of your traditional ones that might be at a Royal Statistics Society conference, there is a marketing that has to be done of making the case for data, especially in a policy arena. Another one is building partnerships and alliances between the private sector. There's a lot of potential data that's there to be used, as well as academia and government as well. Similar to the first point, increasing the political support for statistical capacity building efforts, promoting statistical literacy trainings. You'll hear more about that in the next presentations. And lastly, how to go about achieving sustainable funding for capacity building efforts. It takes resources and funding to do all of this work, so how can that be achieved? Okay, and last slide. So to end it, I think on a somewhat cheesy note, but the idea here is that it's not data for just the sake of data, but rather to have data that can be transformed into information, which can be transformed into knowledge, which can be transformed into action. From where I stand, it's not data just for the sake of it, but rather something that can be used to improve the well-being of lives and communities. So if we think about it that way and kind of look at this cycle of a stronger statistical system, part of the inputs for that will be, literacy, a big topic for today, and then some of these other ones around the value and investment and some of the other stages that come into it.
My name's Grace D'Souza. I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Manchester. I study politics and international relations, and I'm going into my third year. This past summer, I took part in the QSTEP programme. I interned at Open Data Watch and worked on a project with them in collaboration with Data2X. This presentation is just kind of going to be an overview of the work I did when I studied there, and also talking about the skills and the statistical literacy which I gained off the back of that as kind of a case study of how statistical literacy can be built. When I first went to the internship, I had a general knowledge of gender issues and quantitative data and analysis, but it was really important for me that the organisation actually gave me readings to do when I began the internship, so I could learn more about what gender data are and what it means to organisations such as the UN and the Sustainable Development Goals. I needed to gain that background knowledge, and that was part of the whole experience for me. So as an overview, gender data are sex disaggregated data that reflects gender issues and inequalities, and also highlights the difference in reality between men and women in society. Gender data also tends to be collected in non-traditional ways to circumvent the biases which normally arise in other data. Gender data is very present within the SDGs. So UN Women identified 53 gender-related and sex disaggregated indicators within the Sustainable Development Goals. Then there's an additional 33 when excluding duplicates, 33 indicators which can and should be sex disaggregated and therefore qualify as gender data. Deirdre gave a great introduction to the whole tier system. What we can see here, if we look at the tiers, the 53 gender-related indicators, the majority of them are Tier 2 and Tier 3, which means the majority of the gender data are not regularly collected, or they do not have widely recognised methodologies. The same can be seen within the additional 33, even though there's proportionally a higher concentration of Tier 1 indicators. You can still see that there is a lot of Tier 2 and Tier 3 indicators. This shows that there is not a wide availability as they're not regularly collected, and the methodologies may not be consistent with international indicators, so comparisons and studies are very difficult to be made. These comprise different types of data gaps. I worked on the Data Gaps 2.0 project. This project goes to try and answer the question, what data gaps exist in gender indicators? The indicators which we discussed in the research are mainly from the Sustainable Development Goals. However, there are a handful of indicators from other organisations which were deemed by Open Data Watch to be relevant to the study and relevant to gender data as well, in order to cover all bases. We used around 15 case countries. There's still data collection happening now. And these countries are based in the continent of Africa across a wide range of income brackets. The goals of the project were to document international and national availability of important gender indicators. It was important that we distinguish between international and national level availability because there are capacity differences, but also national level availability of data needs to be nationally collected data. It can't be the publication of international data. And so the availability of national data is a really good benchmark for the statistical capacity of that country and what needs to be improved. We also mapped the consistency of the data with international indicators. As I previously said, you need consistency to be able to compare across countries, to use the data in a study. Otherwise, it's very difficult when things have different measures or different definitions, different age brackets. It's very difficult to give any meaning to that kind of data. And we looked at the level of sex disaggregation, because you have kind of more nuanced sex disaggregation than you would previously think, because some indicators you only have data for women. For example, maternal mortality rate, you don't have data for men. And then also some data are only available for one gender, for one sex, even though it should be available for both. And then you have the classic just sex disaggregation or no sex disaggregation. So it was important to distinguish between the different levels of that. Basically, in total, this project should show which data gaps are for gender data, so plans and change can begin to form using advocacy groups such as Data2X or using the UN itself. For each country, this is kind of what my screen looked like all day. That's a lot of tabs. At one point I had 4 windows with like tiny triangles on them, which really stressed the office out. For each indicator, we would go down this checklist at the top. We would do that for every single indicator, and we would do it twice, once for national, once for international. We were working with 105 indicators, so we would do this 210 times for each country, and there are 15 countries. It can be a little time consuming, but there's camaraderie in the office, so it's all right. For each indicator, we looked at availability, so does the data exist at a basic level? If it exists, we have to note down the source, where it exists, what portal, if it's in a PDF, what table, what page. The metadata was very important because, especially on a national level, a lot of the time the metadata wasn't actually available. Metadata would be data about the data, how it was collected, what its definitions are, because that tells you a more nuanced picture of what the data actually are, because a lot of the time, if the metadata varies, then actually you don't have as much consistency as you previously thought. Then we noted down the consistency of data with indicators. The main things we looked at there, the main things we were guided by were measures such as incidence versus prevalence or different disaggregations. We found a lot of data didn't have disability disaggregated for it, which was a massive issue for us because then it wasn't fully consistent with the indicator. And then we also noted the degree of sex disaggregation, as I previously covered. Data were found in PDFs, in portals, and in Excel documents, largely for national level sources. They were in PDF, so we just use Command F, search through it, comb through the PDF, find the table, find the data, note it down. It was much easier for international level data because we were using the same websites each time, and they tended to be in Excel documents and in portals, so it's much easier to access them, which was really interesting. It points to a different issue of availability and openness if you can't really find the data. And we logged everything in an Excel sheet just like this. So that's how we documented the whole process. In terms of analysis, we broke it down into typologies. So we grouped everything together so we could compare between international and national, but also between different categories. So the first typology we did was 3 large categories: environmental, economic, and social. We just grouped the indicators into those categories. It was fairly intuitive. We had a small discussion, but it was pretty straightforward. And then we grouped them into sustainable development goals, and when those goals were too large, for example, we couldn't compare something that had 20 indicators versus a category that had 4, we would break down that goal into subcategories by theme. After this, we did an exploratory analysis, basically just looking at the data, what we could see, what was interesting, what we found compelling. And we're still in the process of creating concrete findings. However, our initial instincts based off the data that we've seen, without doing the report with Data2X that is to come, we can see that international level data generally across the countries we've seen has more available data that is more consistent with international indicators, and it has a higher level of disaggregation by sex, which feels intuitive when you look to the issues of statistical capacity building in developing countries, which many of the case countries are. On to skills learned. The Q-Step initial training session, which wasn't actually part of my placement, actually gave me quite a lot of skills which, even though didn't directly come in helpful with the internship, did actually really help me. Because in the initial training session, which lasted 2 days, we were trained in advanced SPSS, advanced Excel, and also we had an introduction to QGIS. Although I only used Excel in my placement, I had the creativity and the confidence from this training that I knew I could handle data, I knew how to look at data, so when I was given the task of doing analysis, it didn't intimidate me, and I could go straight ahead with the work. And that was really important to me, because a foundation before being thrown in the deep end is, kind of a big deal. The methods we used actually really improved my statistical literacy, because when you're skimming through hundreds of PDFs and Excel documents and portals, and you're looking at so much data, you need to know what the data are telling you. And so that is statistical literacy 101 really for me, and I had to learn very quickly exactly what I was being told, exactly what this meant, if it was relevant to the indicator, and if it wasn't, I would have to note down very specifically what about the data meant that it was scored less than a perfect score. The finding the data process will definitely help me in the future, because I'm going into my 3rd year now, so I will be doing a research project next year, and now I have so much knowledge behind me on how to find data. Literally became an internet sleuth for 2 months. Like, I'm experienced at just like staring at a laptop screen until I find what I need. So like, it sounds sad, but it's also like a really good skill to know. And I think it's a really important part of statistical literacy, is being able to navigate NSO websites, especially with countries such as Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire, where, you know, their websites aren't the same as those in Nigeria or those in South Africa or those in the UK, and you need to be able to deal with those inconsistencies and use search engines like Google to your advantage. Otherwise, you're going to miss really important data that actually does exist. Leading on from that, data presentation in some of the national documents wasn't what I was used to, and so I really learnt the value of very clear, concise presentation and what was needed in a table, such as a source or a date or the measure. Things that feel intuitive, but now I know like they are so valuable, because if you don't put it in the table, whoever's reading it then has to go back through your methodology, or they have to like really sift through your report, which can take a lot more time than they might want to spend. The analysis was also really great, because I really enjoyed this part. As Deirdre will know, I got pretty excited when we started doing the analysis, because I was able to kind of take it down my own path. They gave me the freedom that I wanted. I was able to contribute. I felt like my ideas were valued. There were alterations to the methodology which I felt that I had contributed to, and that was really exciting for me, because that makes me feel like here's a skill which I can do, and I feel confident in doing. I'm not intimidated by this. This is something that belongs to me. This is something I can do, which might feel quite basic, but I took a lot of joy in that, and actually learned so much from being able to do the analysis myself with like a gentle guiding hand from the organisation, as opposed to just learning that it is a type of analysis which you can do in a classroom. Maybe I wouldn't have gone back to it. Softer skills, although they're not traditionally associated with statistical capacity building, I think they're really important. They comprise a really important part of my experience, because I learned how to discuss my analysis in a professional setting so that people understood, partner organisations or people within my organisation, and that is a skill I believe that I will be using a lot in the future. I also learnt time management, because we were doing analyses for multiple countries at the same time, as well as multiple documentations, writing reports. There was a lot, and doing this presentation. There was a lot going on all at once. I believe that my time management has improved from this, or will improve in the future from the skills that I learned. And also, like, I know I've spoken about it before, but I believe confidence is a really important aspect of this, and I feel confident in a professional setting now. And although I knew that I was going into a professional setting before, now when I go into a job in the future, I feel that I will know how to hold myself, I'll know how to act, and I'll feel more confident when applying for that job or when going for that position, which means a lot to me personally, because I haven't quite broken into the world of work yet, but it feels like a bit of a brighter future for me. Finally, just some nice reflections. I feel like I've benefited hugely from this program. If you just look back to the last slide, like all of the different skills I've learned, things that I never thought I would be able to do, but now I feel like I have ownership over them. I feel like the benefits from this program will have a knock-on effect for my future choices. So if I look at the dissertation topic I'm doing now, it's completely different to what I thought I was going to do at the beginning of summer. And I had the amazing opportunity of the fact that the bosses I had at Open Data Watch are experts in their fields, and I was able to ask them very direct questions about the things that they have learned during their careers, and that has definitely informed my choice of dissertation and what I feel I'm going to study. I feel like it will have a place within the academic field, it will contribute, it will be interesting for me and other people that read it. And that's really important for me because right now that's kind of most of what I'm thinking about is my final year at university and how to make it count. Other than that, master's courses, I never thought I would be looking at. Social statistics at Manchester. Turns out that the master's course I want to do, the master's course that will help me, is actually right in front of me. I have all the resources I need to do that. And also career prospects. I'm looking at entirely different careers within the same sector that I always thought I wanted to look at: efficacy, pointed, sustainable impact, making the right choices, the right decisions, staying informed within the area of development. But I never thought that statistics was the way I was going to do that. Even though, you know, being here, it feels intuitive to everyone in the room. It wasn't intuitive to me at the time. It's really exciting, and I'm so glad that I had this internship at this point in my life because I was able to see the value of it, but I've had it so early on that all of these choices are still in front of me. So I'm able to learn from the internship, and it will have a knock-on effect in my future as opposed to me regretting my past. I already know that these skills will help me. Finally, I don't know if you can tell, but I found the whole thing quite interesting. I definitely have something I'm newly passionate about that I didn't really think I could be before. You know, yay statistics, which, I mean, it's great. Like, I'm loving it, clearly. But it's great. Like, things I never thought I would be able to do, things I never thought I would understand enough to be interested in them. I now am. I'm going to use them. It's very exciting. I believe this whole process has been extremely important for me and my development as a person. I've gained skills and confidence and everything else. I feel it will affect me in the future, and genuinely, thank you so much, Jackie. Thank you so much, Deirdre, and anyone who made this happen, because it's been an incredible experience for me. And I think any way anyone else could have a similar experience in statistical literacy, learning within an organization, within the scene, knowing how it works in the real world, I could not advocate for that anymore.
So my name is Frances Braz, and I work at the Office for National Statistics in the Sustainable Development Goals team, and we are basically responsible for reporting against the Sustainable Development Goals on behalf of the UK. And today I will talk a bit about some things that we've been working on recently, mainly focusing on how we've been working on reporting against some of the indicators using more novel techniques, and how we are using these kind of experiences that we are building within our team to also help other countries in their part of reporting against Sustainable Development Goals. So, although we've already had a very good introduction to the Sustainable Development Goals, I thought I'd reiterate that actually there's quite a lot of them. So we've got 17 goals divided under 169 targets, and then there's 244 indicators. But actually it's 232 because a couple of them are duplicates. But then besides this massive amount of indicators, we also have disaggregations. So every indicator is supposed to be disaggregated by 8 characteristics. So gender is one of them, but also geography, ethnicity, race, migrant status, disability, income. So basically what we have is, not only do we have to report against this amazing amount of indicators, we also have to provide data for all these different categories. So this is a huge exercise to actually find all this data and make sure that we are leaving no one behind, because that's why we want to report for all these different groups, to make sure that everyone is counted and included and will therefore progress in life, really. So as the Office for National Statistics, as I already said, we are responsible for reporting against Sustainable Development Goals. And we are basically there to make sure that the process in which we do that is transparent and rigorous. And so we collect, we collate, and we analyze. We then present and disseminate the progress against UK Sustainable Development Goals.
So we are responsible for the data part of it, but we are not responsible for policy implementation. So we're really just looking at the data and the way in which we can provide this to society and to the UN. So what we do, and it is in the main thing, is we have a national reporting platform where we store all our data. And this is what that looks like. So everyone can access this really easily. You can then click on any of the goals and then click through to any of the indicators. So for example, here I've clicked on goal 8 and then indicator, I think it is 852, which is the unemployment rate. So here you can see the trend of unemployment in the UK quite transparently. And then you can also disaggregate this data very simply by choosing one of the categories on the left. So in this case, I've chosen gender. What you can then do is you can also download the data, so the data in the graph, but also all the data that is actually on the website. And you can also find the metadata, where this data came from. And yeah, so basically all the information that you need to make good choices based on this data is available for everyone to use, download, examine. So we also have some transparency on how our work is going. So currently we are reporting 151 indicators out of the 244. But that's only at the headline level. And if we start looking at disaggregations, we know that actually we're not quite there. So over all the indicators, we have about 459 disaggregation gaps, which sounds like a lot, but considering the amount of indicators that need to be disaggregated, we're getting there slowly but surely. And you can also see that one of our biggest disaggregation gaps is actually geography. And after that, it's quickly followed by migratory status, disability status, and ethnicity. We have, as the UK, signed up to something called the Inclusive Data Charter, which kind of underlines our commitment to disaggregating this data and making sure that everyone is counted and included as part of Leave No One Behind. And this Inclusive Data Charter was presented at the UN at a high-level political forum to kind of internationally establish our commitment and together with other countries and organizations to make sure that we count and include everyone in the data that we collect. So if we start looking at the geography indicators, because geography is one of our biggest disaggregation gaps, so we thought that would be a good place to start and start collecting data. And if we look at it, we can see that a lot of our geography indicators don't have local disaggregations. So what we mean with local disaggregation is that we want to report our statistics at the most local level possible, because we know that there's really big differences between separate areas that cannot be observed if we just look at country level data or even region level data for the UK. And we wanted to kind of have a start at fixing this. You can also see that not all of our data covers the whole of the UK, but we are responsible for providing data on behalf of the UK. But because we have these different countries, so we have England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, that all have different government departments, different institutions, the data is not collected consistently across. So this is something that we've all started to look into, at how we can more wholly cover the UK and actually report for everyone. So we started a geography accelerator project, a 3-month project kind of aimed to have this quick sprint in getting more local data, filling some of our headline gaps. So again, for some of the indicators, we couldn't report any data at all. But we knew that there were techniques such as geospatial science and Earth observation that could actually help us report against these, improve geographic coverage, and improve our national reporting platforms. That's a platform that I showed earlier that holds all the data, and the way in which we communicate this data to the public. So in order to do that, we joined up with a project from the United Nations, the United Nations Statistical Division, and Esri, which is a software provider that provides GIS software. Some people might know ArcGIS. That's what they're most famous for. This project involves quite a number of member states, and the idea of this project was to use Esri software and Esri capabilities to kind of start producing new data for the SDGs and look at different ways of reporting this data and communicating this data to the wider public. So what we started doing is we started writing an explainer piece, because we know that not everyone has this statistical literacy to understand geographic data. I think there was a lot that we needed to learn ourselves still as well. So we had some of our geography experts in ONS write this article outlining basic concepts in geography. This is part of a series of explainers that we're doing. So we're doing them, for example, relating to data collection, the difference between national data and international data. So we'll be publishing this series in autumn. So it will be a number of small, short articles that are very accessible to general public to kind of get some more background knowledge in statistics and how statistics should be understood and what they actually mean. Then we also produced a story map. So a story map I would kind of describe as a web application that combines a story, so a narrative about data, with the data and with maps. So the idea is that you can scroll through this, it's interactive, you can click on places, you can look at, hey, what does this mean for my local area in, let's say, Cardiff, and in that way get a better idea of what data means and how different indicators in SDGs are related. So what we did is we created a story map looking at the relationship between air pollution and death related to air pollution, and kind of see how these relationships evolve over time and what that means for people in local areas. Then we also used this Esri software to fill 2 of our headline data gaps. So these are indicators for which we don't have any data. We don't think there's any data available at the UK level. So the indicators that we looked at is indicator 911, which is proportion of rural population with access to an all-season road, and 1131, which is population growth rate to land consumption rate. Now, I know that indicator 911 doesn't sound very relevant to the UK, because I think most people will have access to an all-season road. We don't have really seasons that mess with the roads too much. I mean, this year we had quite a lot of snow, but it's a couple of days and then everything's fine. But in other countries, this might actually be quite an issue. And us looking into this indicator and actually providing data and finding out how we can get this data, because it's not something that is regularly collected, can then help other countries also do this by looking at the methodology and learning from our experiences. So what we actually did for 911 is we had a road network which was produced by Ordnance Survey, which we then overlaid with a population data set, and then we kind of created a border around every road and then calculated what proportion of the population falls within that road and in the border. And we worked together with Esri UK and Ordnance Survey to kind of evaluate the way in which we did that, methodologies and the outcomes, because the people working on this project weren't geography experts, but statisticians, social researchers, but not so much GIS trained, other than the training we've received for helping on this project. So we built actually quite a lot of capacity within our own team as well. And the idea is that this work is currently being written up into a report and recommendations and methodologies that will then be shared with some of our partner countries. Another part that we try to do in this project is create maps on our tool. So currently what you can do is you can get the graphs, but that doesn't really tell you much about local data at all. So what we wanted was to create a map that shows you the trends over time, that can show you some of the disaggregations as well, if they're available, and just so that people can more clearly understand geographical disaggregations and what this might mean on local levels. And then we use this map to also share with partner countries. So not only are we sharing our methodologies and our techniques, we're also sharing parts of our tool with countries. For example, in the past few months, we have had visits from Rwanda and Ghana, and we help them clone our tool. So our tool is completely open source. It can be taken by anyone. So if a country or an organization wants to report against the SDGs in the same way that we are doing, if they like our approach, they can simply take the code from the tool, copy it, and put their own data in. So we've been helping some of these partner countries to clone our tool and basically start putting data in. And recently, we've also gone down to Rwanda to further help them build this tool and include these kind of maps, which will hopefully help them report against the SDGs in a very transparent and open way. So, in short, we report all our data on a national platform, which is open to everyone. We are finding new ways to communicate this data and to also kind of build more understanding about what this data means among the general public. We are filling data using new techniques and are sharing how we are filling these data gaps with other countries and institutions to kind of share our knowledge. And we communicate all our experience in regards to collecting data for the Sustainable Development Goals to build international capacity.